Okay, it's on. Hi, I'm Sapna Maheshwari, and I'm a business reporter, and I cover retail at BuzzFeed News. And I used to work at Bloomberg News and contributed to Business Week for a few years before that.
Hi, I'm Tseng. I'm an editor at Fortune.com. I started about 5 years ago as a writer-reporter covering finance and economics. And in the last year, I transitioned to an editor editing our guest columns.
I'll show you this one. And I'm Evan Nowell. So I actually just moved over to RF Bender, which is a PR firm. I'm a director of media relations over there. And then for the past 4 years, I had spent at Columbia Business School in a media relations role and working with these lovely ladies to my left. And so, what I have really done in my career is work with the media in terms of presenting stories, usually from at Columbia Business School from our thought leaders, and then helping them shape whatever is the business topics of the day, or research or any thought leadership or any other trends that would be in the media.
So my name is Michelle Greenwald. My credentials in this context are I had a blog on Inc.com focused on innovation for a while, and I've been blogging for Forbes on innovation and marketing for a little over a year. Wrote a book on innovation called Catalyzing Innovation, which is a very interesting approach to innovating in a more methodical, systematic way. And then I teach marketing at Columbia Business School, NYU Stern, Cornell, and a Spanish business school. So anyway, I'd like to just start asking, what do you see as that were the biggest changes in business journalism in the last few years, and what do you see going forward? What can we expect that you think is going to change the landscape in the next few years? So I guess we'll just keep going in order. Is that all right? Okay.
Sure. So I think just like all other parts of journalism, distribution has changed radically. The fact that I left Bloomberg News for BuzzFeed probably would have, actually did sound crazy 2 years ago when we started this section. It wasn't that crazy in retrospect. The rise of something like Business Insider is totally new, just the way things are spread across the web. And I think there's actually a larger general audience for business news. People really care about brands and the companies they interact with, and it makes sense as companies grow ever larger and more profitable. It's become a much more important beat, I think. And yeah, again, distribution to on the social web. More prominent news organizations are linking to upstarts like BuzzFeed and the like, and on Twitter too, and Facebook, you're seeing a totally different spread of information.
So sort of just touching on your point as far as distribution, I guess the obvious answer would be like mobile. I always have trouble saying that word. It's really changed the way news is gathered and how it's delivered. It remains to be seen if social networking sites like Facebook become like sort of the modern day paper boy and deliver news to consumers over social media. I think the less obvious answer, at least to me, is there's much more competition when it comes to business news. I'm from Fortune, so it's a very old brand. Fortune magazine was created around the time of the Great Depression. I think what's interesting is that in business journalism, there's a lot of new players like Quartz, BuzzFeed, even LinkedIn that was created purely as in a digital format as opposed to a print, sort of a print format. So to me, it's interesting to see all this competition going on and a lot of disruption, as in the case with most industries, from retail to you name it. The web is basically disrupting everything, including business journalism. And with that said, usually business news audience is usually, I think, like an older audience. It's relatively somebody who's interested in their 401ks or someone who has equity. But with the growth of the web and with these new players, I think the readership has the potential to become much younger, especially with people go into startups. You see a lot of startups, your 20 20-something-year-old, creating his or her own company. I think the web really is an opportunity to sort of get more younger business news readers. So.
And I think with this disruption, so from the media relations side of things, it's presented more opportunities for brands, for thought leaders to interact with the media and have their content covered in a way that's compelling. So, before, you would almost have to compete for entry into stories, and you still have to do that to some regard, but there are much more opportunities to interact with these journalists, whether it's for commentary or whether it's for contributed content. Like Fortune has a great network for contributors, Forbes does as well. So really there are more opportunities in getting your message and your brand's message out there.
Okay, great. Okay, so a lot of people in the audience are startups, and if you're a startup, you have a limited budget. People do, not hard to do a website, not hard to do YouTube videos, but if you really want to get credible media to talk about your startup, I thought it'd be interesting to hear perspectives on how they can pitch media. And I know, we were just discussing that you're both very limited in a way that you can't do a million stories, you have to be selective. What's the best way for a startup to pitch both your publications and others in general, because maybe it's too difficult, to have realistically expect Forbes or Fortune or BuzzFeed to cover them?
That's a really good question. It made me really think about pitches that have worked with me. So, first, I think pitches always need to be really tailored to the reporter. The worst is when someone emails every single person on our relatively small business team of 6 people, and we all know that we got the email and that it was totally not, no one looked at the kinds of stories we wrote or why it would be relevant to us. It's really easy just to look up what a reporter writes basically on any website now. So if the last 20 stories they wrote, you can't actually see it in there, and you have to really be honest with yourself. You don't want to waste your time or the reporter's time, I would say. And also, just covering mostly publicly traded retailers, just looking at, which companies your startup is competing with. If it's actually making headway in that competition. Sometimes interactions. For example, I wrote about Wanilo when it was relatively nascent because some brands like Abercrombie were starting to put this Wanilo shopping button on their website. So being able to tie the startup to a broader brand that people actually know made it a compelling story, for example. So I think those are a couple of things.
And just one more question to build on it. How, do you look at the headline, the subject line? Do you throw out a lot of emails? Are you inundated? What should people do? Should they be very concise in both the subject head and the email? Because it's primarily email that you decide. You don't like people calling. What's the best way to quickly get your attention?
Yeah, probably email and a well-tailored subject line and a concise email. I probably get more than 100 pitches a day.
Wow.
And it's actually the worst part of my job.
I don't disagree. It's very similar. At Fortune, we get calls all the time, and I don't know. I don't count my pitches, but it's kind of, yeah, I can imagine. And people sort of cold call, and I totally understand where they're coming from. There's a lot of startups out there, and it's a very interesting time to work at a startup. At Fortune, we covered a lot of large companies, but increasingly you can't ignore the startup who's going to disrupt whatever X industry. So I think I don't cover startups. But from a journalist standpoint, I think one of the things that's most interesting to look at is sort of how much money this startup has raised, who are the backers, are they big names, if the startup is backed by Andreessen Horowitz, you can't ignore that if you have that in the subject line or whatever. I think, at least for me personally, if a woman, women are so underrepresented in tech in general. If there's a woman who is heading a startup in Silicon Valley, that's interesting to me just because you don't hear of that often. But overall, I think you know, I think just sort of going back to your point, I think being very concise and brevity is very important as well. So.
And Evan has the perspective of pitching the media. So
Yes, so I have
balance.
the perspective of pitching these guys, specifically at Columbia Business School. We had a huge entrepreneur community. I mean, a lot of our students, even while they were in school, were going and starting up and pitching business plans. And we even have a startup lab downtown. And so I worked with a lot of those to present their companies to the media. And it's like what these guys are saying. And so my general rule of thumb when reaching out to any member of the media is take the extra 5-10 minutes out of your day to keep up with these guys who are important, that you recognize who's important in the landscape. I mean, stay abreast of what they're covering, like Sapna said. Really get to know them and what stories really jive with them. I mean, I've learned in my career that that's so much better than compiling a list of 100 contacts and going out to 100 people and maybe getting 10 responses. If I go out to the 5 to 10 people that I know are going to respond to me and cover the story, it's so much more of a benefit in the grand scheme of things. And like they also said, it's important to really do a little bit of research into what is really your company's competitive advantage. What is really the compelling story there? And then take that and drill it down into digestible points for them to really, that really resonates with them. Try to give them as much of the story that they're gonna write as you can.
Oh, and I mean, just to pop in, you did a great job with that when I was covering JCPenney at Bloomberg when Ron Johnson was trying to totally revamp this old company, and it was a really fascinating business story at the time. And you reached out and you're like, here's this guy who used to work at these department stores. He had all this experience, and he ended up being a really valuable voice in these stories. And so sometimes, I mean, if your startup has some angle on news that's going on, or just a big story of the day, with JCPenney, there's a lot of features about how much people like coupons and discounts. Maybe you have a startup that operates in that area and you can present a new kind of viewpoint. So I guess kind of keeping track of the big stories of reporters you follow, I mean, is a good way to perhaps to pitch.
And then this is for any of you. Do you recommend, there's 2 news wires at least, and you can send out for a relatively inexpensive amount, like $750 to $1,000, you can send to pretty much all the media a 1-page press release. Do you look at those, and that's the way, it's the complete opposite approach of what you're saying, but do you think that's worth doing at all?
I think the most successful pitches are those where I have a relationship with, the PR firm or somebody. I mean, obviously I had a relationship with you at Columbia Business School, and Evan's pitches were incredibly tailored. He kind of knew sort of going back to what you've mentioned. So, for instance, if something big was happening at JCPenney and there's a Columbia professor who used to be a JCPenney exec who can speak to it, I mean, it should be incredibly tailored. It's better to be more
quality, not quantity.
It's better to be much more specific than just send out a blast email. So okay. It's almost like when you're asking somebody for if you're asking somebody for help to introduce you for a job or a connection.
Right.
You don't want to just email just everybody, because then after a while no one's going to really take you.
Right. And just
seriously.
related to something you said, do you recommend hiring a PR firm, or do you think people can do it themselves who are startups?
I'm not sure. I mean, I guess I don't think I'm experienced enough to speak from that side of it.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there are certain PR firms that I think are more credible and that you'll probably look at a pitch from before some others. But, I mean, it depends how big the startup is. If it's not that big, you could probably do it yourself or just hire someone in-house. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I've noticed that a lot of very small startups who don't have sort of necessarily the budget to do PR, I mean, you can create your own relationships with specific reporters or writers, have a coffee with them, or, have a brief meeting with them and talk to them what you're about. But I think with the advantage with the PR firm is that they already have these contacts. Whereas opposed to if you didn't have a PR, if you weren't working with a PR firm, you just have to start scratch and do your own research basically on who to contact.
Great. Did you want anything or no? Okay, great. So I think we'll leave it open now to Q&A. Does anybody have any questions?
When you say you have 100 pitches a day, do you mean you go through all of them?
That's where the good subject line comes in handy. A lot of the times the pitches will be totally unrelated to what I write about, and it's clear from the subject line. Like I got a pitch from a pretty prominent PR firm yesterday inviting me to a sailing trip with 2 teenage sailors next week. I was just like, this isn't even a business story. It would be great, right?
But do you sometimes refer, like, that may not be a great example, but do you sometimes refer that this could be interesting, but there's another writer who, you know?
So that's, I think, a bad strategy that a lot of PR people use is, oh, I'll email this person this irrelevant thing, and then they'll give me the name of the right person. And that is so disrespectful and such a waste of time. And honestly, like, if it's something like that, I just don't even respond, which I feel bad about because I understand, you know, like everyone is doing their job. But with 100 extra emails in addition to all the analyst notes I read and company filings and interacting with the companies I cover, it's just too much. It's not possible to go through all of them.
One question on the relationship thing, what you said. I would be interested, how open are you as journalists to like having relationships with people from the startup scene, because you might know that they are not only interested in you like personally, but maybe want to then show up in the media. Don't you feel kind of like pressured, that you're like kind of forced into publishing something?
I mean, it depends on what kind of reporter you are, but typically you're not. Reporters aren't supposed to write stories as a favor to a friend or a colleague. Or it would be a conflict of interest. When I talk about relationships, I mean a professional relationship as opposed to a personal relationship. I know for me personally, if I have a friend who coincidentally has a startup, I would never write about that startup just because we have a personal relationship. I could introduce them to somebody else. But I would never. It would be a conflict of interest for me.
And I can actually just answer really briefly. I think it also falls on the relation side of it. So the PR person. I mean, I think it's a matter of the professional relationship that she's talking about and really understanding when there is a story or when there is an opportunity to be covered, and understanding that not everything that you pitch and speak to the reporter about is gonna wind up in the media. And I think it's about expectations.
How do you use social media to choose your stories or to communicate the stories you think are important? I don't know if you research someone's LinkedIn page or how those things play into what you do.
Yeah, I actually use LinkedIn a lot in my reporting because there's a LinkedIn for Journalists account that you can get as a reporter where you can send in-mail to people, which is invaluable as a business reporter because if I'm covering a company, obviously I don't want to email someone at their work address because companies check those. Or if it's a former employee of somewhere, LinkedIn in-mail usually goes to a personal email account. And so if I hear about something interesting, you can reach out to people that way. And that's helped me source up some of my best scoops, honestly. And I use Twitter a lot to share my stories and to see what others are writing. It's a great way to follow my competitors on the retail beat and see what scoops are on Fortune and on other websites. I think earlier someone said social media is like junk food, and I actually would disagree. I mean, I think that oftentimes social media kind of gives a voice to people who might not otherwise be represented in the media. For example, there is often a lack of diversity of voices in many stories, and it's easier to find people now with the social web. I mean, of course, you have to do the same research you would as a reporter to verify identities and track people down. But, like, for example, when Target had this Lilly Pulitzer debacle on Sunday, I was just looking into it on Monday, and it was pretty easy to search Instagram and find people who are reselling the items. And so then I found email addresses and reached out to folks and verified them on LinkedIn and with public records to make sure that no one was lying about who they were to me. But they had pretty extensive social media presences, and was able to talk about the reseller point of view on this collection, which was different from some other outlets. So I mean, that's an example of a way that social media is actually quite useful.
Why do news websites have comment sections?
Why do news sites have comment sections? I think it's really a matter of engagement. I think like as journalists, we don't want the conversation to just be one way. In journalism, we want it to be a very two-way conversation on whatever topic we're writing about. So,
to add two more things, I think it makes people more loyal to the publication because they feel that they're interested in their voice, and also they stay on the site longer. So I think it's good from that standpoint as well.
We've actually sort of adjusted the commenting on the news part of BuzzFeed. We took away the comments that didn't require a Facebook identity, and also took away the badges that we put on the stories, like LOL, WTF, OMG, on news stories, because we didn't see as much value for them. And also by switching it to Facebook comments, like you still will have people that make Facebook, like fake Facebook accounts to comment on news, but honestly it's so annoying to do that because it changes so much of how you travel like the internet, because Facebook is linked to so many things, that it actually cleaned up the comment section a lot. And sometimes it's valuable. Yeah, people like to debate or comment on news. I think it makes people happy, though I try not to read comments very much.
Yeah, and we also, I'm sure at BuzzFeed you do the same, but we monitor the comment section. So if there's anything like inappropriate, we people flag it and we take it down. So it's not like they can say anything they want.
Yeah.
So as a young startup trying to build credibility, would you recommend going through to some niche blogs that would be more interested, I guess, in your product and your service and what you're doing, publish about you, and get like a nice sum of information there, and then once that is completed, once we have a nice base, reaching out to you guys, a larger platform, and does that make it easier for you to get you guys to publish about the story about our startup, et cetera?
I don't think it really makes a difference. I mean, just because you were published at a certain publication doesn't necessarily mean that we'll more likely write about you. If anything, we probably were like, that was already covered. Like, what else is new? Like, we always want, write about the fresh angle. I think what's really important is sort of, as far as startups, we always ask, how does your startup fit into the broader picture of what's going on industry-wide? Are you guys, disrupting a certain sector? What specifically is special about your company? And how does it relate to what others are doing in terms of either raising money or innovation, or do you have like a CEO that came from like a big Fortune 500 company and now he or she's like starting anew and coming out with this new product? So it's really more about how your company ties into the broader picture of whatever product or service you're developing.
What are some tips in starting this professional relationship with the journalists or reporters?
I think going back again, it's okay. So this is about establishing your professional relationships with journalists as a media relations professional or a PR person. So I think it's really important, like I said earlier on, about really getting to know what they write about, getting to know the outlets first, what differentiates each outlet, and then even further into the weeds, what differentiates each reporter. Because like Sapna said, you don't want to send a pitch to 5 different reporters at BuzzFeed. You want to find the right one for whatever you're trying to pitch. So I think starting those relationships is about first learning about the person, and then when you're comfortable starting that relationship is providing them something of value. You need to introduce yourself and provide them something right off the bat that is valuable. So one example is when I worked with Sapna, it was for a Sears or a JCPenney story, and luckily Columbia Business School had a marketing professor that was the former CEO of Sears Canada. That's an asset right there for a business or a retail reporter. So understanding that your asset on this side, and then who is the proper person to reach out to on the other side. And like I said, I think it's important to do your research beforehand. So before I even reached out to Sapna, I read her past 5, I would say 5 to 10 articles, like really understand like what she writes about, the type of companies she covers, just to make sure that she's the right person.
Okay, thank you all. Great, really great.